At 6:47 this morning Gulf Standard Time, radar stations across the Persian Gulf detected something that instantly triggered emergency alerts from Doha to Dubai. Multiple waves of Iranian drones and ballistic missiles were tracked moving across the Gulf, while at the same moment American and Israeli warplanes were already deep inside Iranian airspace, launching what military analysts are calling the most aggressive strike campaign against Iran in decades. But the explosions themselves are not the real story. The real story is what may happen next, because behind the airstrikes and missile interceptions, a far more dramatic development is quietly unfolding. According to defense signals and diplomatic chatter emerging overnight, officials in Washington are preparing a demand that could fundamentally redraw the geopolitical map of the Middle East. Iran must immediately abandon its missile program and nuclear ambitions, or face a vastly expanded phase of this war. And if that escalation begins, the consequences will not stay confined to the battlefield. Energy ministers across the Gulf are already warning that continued strikes near the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage responsible for nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply, could force energy exports to shut down within weeks. If that artery closes, analysts say oil prices could surge toward $150 per barrel, unleashing an inflation shock capable of shaking economies from Europe to Asia. This is no longer just a regional conflict. It may be the start of a global economic chain reaction. So before the full picture is softened, delayed, or filtered elsewhere, make sure you subscribe right now, because the next 48 hours could determine whether this crisis stabilizes or spirals into a geopolitical earthquake that reshapes the global order. In this analysis, I'm going to walk you step by step through what is really unfolding behind this rapidly escalating conflict, because the situation is far more complex and far more dangerous than the headlines suggest. First, I will break down the 3 strategic demands now reportedly being pushed toward Iran, and why those demands are designed not just to weaken Tehran militarily, but to force a fundamental shift in the balance of power across the entire Middle East. Second, I will explain the economic pressure building behind the scenes, especially around the Strait of Hormuz, and why energy ministers and financial analysts are warning that even a partial disruption of oil shipments could send shockwaves through global markets. Third, I will outline the military escalation signals now emerging from Washington, Tel Aviv, and the Gulf states, including the deployments and strike patterns that suggest this conflict may be entering a new and far more aggressive phase. And finally, I will show you the critical deadline approaching in the coming days, when decisions made by leaders on all sides could determine whether this crisis stabilizes or explodes into something much larger. To understand why this conflict has suddenly reached such a dangerous level, we need to step back from the headlines and examine the strategic structure of what is happening right now. Because what we are witnessing is not simply a series of military strikes, it is the convergence of ***, 3 powerful pressure mechanisms, military, economic, and geopolitical, being applied simultaneously. And when those 3 forces collide, the results can reshape entire regions. Let's break them down one by one. Evidence 1. The scale of the military campaign. The first indicator that something extraordinary is unfolding is the scale and coordination of the strikes inside Iran. According to military updates released during the first week of the conflict, hundreds of targets across Iranian territory have already been struck, including missile storage sites, air defense systems, naval infrastructure, and underground command facilities. In some operations, dozens of fighter jets were deployed simultaneously in carefully coordinated strike waves. Military strategists say this pattern is significant. A former NATO air operations planner explained in a recent defense briefing that this level of sustained air power is typically used not just to send a message, but to dismantle a country's ability to project military force altogether. In other words, the objective may not simply be deterrence, the objective may be strategic paralysis. This would explain why many of the targets reported so far involve Iran's ballistic missile infrastructure, the very systems that allow Tehran to threaten cities and shipping lanes across the region. And if that capability is removed, the balance of power across the Middle East could change overnight. If you're beginning to see how serious this situation is becoming, go ahead and hit the like button, because the next layer of this story reveals why the military pressure alone is only part of the equation. Evidence 2. The economic pressure point. The second piece of the puzzle lies not in the skies above Iran, but in the waters just south of it, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow shipping corridor, barely 20 miles wide at its tightest point, handles nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply every single day. Tankers carrying energy from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates pass through this channel before reaching global markets, which means whoever controls stability in this waterway holds enormous leverage over the global economy. Now consider what has happened during this conflict. Missile and drone activity in the Gulf has increased dramatically. Shipping insurers have begun raising risk premiums. Some tankers have already delayed or rerouted voyages. And energy officials across the region have quietly warned that if attacks escalate further, exports could temporarily shut down altogether. Financial analysts understand exactly what that would mean. Energy markets are extremely sensitive to supply disruptions. Even small interruptions can cause rapid price spikes. A sustained closure of the Strait of Hormuz could push oil prices toward $150 per barrel or beyond, triggering inflation across transportation, manufacturing, and food supply chains worldwide. One veteran commodity strategist recently described the scenario bluntly. If Hormuz closes, he said, you're not just looking at an energy shock, you're looking at a global economic shock. And that possibility is why governments far beyond the Middle East are now watching this conflict with increasing alarm. Evidence 3. The political objective. The third and perhaps most important layer involves the political demands now emerging from Washington and its allies. Publicly, officials have emphasized a clear objective: Iran must never obtain nuclear weapons. But behind that statement lies a broader strategic calculation. For years, Iran's regional influence has depended heavily on two capabilities: its missile arsenal and its network of allied militant groups across the Middle East. Together, those tools allow Tehran to project power far beyond its borders. By targeting missile production sites and military infrastructure, the current campaign appears designed to systematically dismantle that projection capability. A former U.S. National Security Advisor once summarized this strategy with a striking phrase: "You don't defeat a regional power by occupying it," he said. "You defeat it by removing the tools it uses to shape the region." If that strategy is indeed what we are seeing unfold, then the current conflict may represent an attempt not just to weaken Iran, but to permanently reshape the strategic balance of the Middle East. And that brings us to the most critical question of all: how does Iran respond? Because the answer to that question will determine whether this conflict stabilizes or expands into something far larger. We now need to look at what could happen next. Because once the current military pressure reaches its breaking point, leaders on all sides will face a series of decisions that could push this crisis in dramatically different directions. And those decisions lead directly into the three possible future scenarios that analysts around the world are now discussing. So what happens when the pressure we just discussed reaches its breaking point? Because every geopolitical crisis eventually arrives at the same moment, the decision point. The moment when leaders must decide whether to escalate, compromise, or walk away. Right now, analysts are watching three possible scenarios that could unfold in the coming days. And each of them carries very different consequences for the region and for the global economy. Scenario 1, strategic compromise. The first and most stabilizing scenario is a controlled compromise. Under this outcome, Iran could agree, either directly or through intermediaries, to limit its missile activity, reduce military operations in the Gulf, and return to negotiations surrounding its nuclear program. In exchange, Western powers could slow the pace of airstrikes and open the door to diplomatic talks. This type of outcome would not necessarily be described publicly as surrender. Instead, it would likely be framed as a temporary de-escalation agreement designed to prevent further regional destruction. Markets would react immediately. Oil prices would likely fall, shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz would stabilize, and governments around the world would breathe a cautious sigh of relief. But this scenario requires something that is extremely rare in moments like this: mutual restraint. And right now, restraint is in very short supply. Scenario 2, partial compliance and controlled conflict. The second possibility is far messier. In this scenario, Iran refuses to fully accept outside demands, but avoids triggering a full-scale regional war. Instead, Tehran could continue limited retaliation through missile strikes, drone attacks, or proxy groups operating across the Middle East. At the same time, US and Israeli forces could maintain targeted strikes against Iranian military infrastructure without expanding the conflict into a ground invasion. What this creates is something analysts call a controlled confrontation. Not peace, not total war, but a tense and unstable middle ground where attacks continue intermittently while both sides try to avoid crossing the line that would ignite a much wider conflict. The danger here is that this type of situation can last months or even years, slowly grinding down regional stability while keeping global markets permanently on edge. Scenario 3, full regional escalation. The third scenario is the one that keeps military planners awake at night, a complete breakdown of restraint. If Iran were to respond by targeting major energy infrastructure, attempting to close the Strait of Hormuz entirely, or expanding attacks against US bases and regional allies, the response from Washington and its partners would almost certainly escalate dramatically. That could mean expanded air campaigns, naval blockades, and potentially direct strikes against additional strategic targets across the region. Once that level of escalation begins, the conflict would no longer be contained. Energy exports from the Gulf could collapse, global markets could experience extreme volatility, and the Middle East could enter the most dangerous security crisis in a generation. And at that point, the question would no longer be whether the war spreads. The question would be how far it spreads. Right now, the clock is ticking. What began as a series of airstrikes and retaliatory missile attacks has rapidly evolved into a geopolitical standoff that could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East for years to come. Military pressure is intensifying, economic pressure is building, and the strategic decisions being made in Washington, Tehran, and regional capitals could determine whether this crisis stabilizes or spirals into something far larger. Because at its core, this conflict is no longer just about missiles or military bases. It's about who sets the rules of power in the region moving forward. If Iran backs down, the strategic landscape of the Middle East could shift dramatically. But if Tehran chooses confrontation instead, the consequences could extend far beyond the battlefield into global energy markets, financial systems, and political alliances. So now the question turns to you. Has Iran already crossed a line it cannot walk back from? Or is the West pushing this confrontation toward a breaking point of its own? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every perspective. And if you want to stay ahead of the next developments in this unfolding crisis, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because the story is far from over.